Let's see. So thank you, everybody. My name is Andy Trice. I am a developer evangelist with Adobe, and here tonight to talk about PhoneGap. And so this is going to be kind of a general introduction, like getting familiar with it. What is it? What can you do with it? Like, what kinds of apps can you create? How do you go about creating those different kinds of apps? I will be recording this, so if anybody was wondering what I'm doing up here, fiddling with something on a tripod, that I am recording this whole thing. So if you want to see it again later, or if you think it's really a good thing to make fun of me, forward it out to your friends. That's fantastic because more people are viewing the video. But
you could upload that into the Meetup site.
Yeah, I'm going to post it on YouTube and then
the Meetup site.
Yeah, well, I'm going to post it on YouTube and then put a link on the Meetup site so that you'll be able to get to it. But a couple things before I get started. So I'm thinking. A couple things before I get started. I like to treat these kind of sessions as a conversation. So if you have questions at any point in time, feel free to raise your hand and ask away, because a lot of times that turns into a dialogue between all of us. One person might be thinking the same kind of thing. It generally leads to a little bit, I would say, a better connection with the audience. Like because I'm here, my whole role as a developer evangelist is to be able to answer your questions. So definitely don't hesitate to ask them at any point in time. Now, again, thanks to Sid and Josh for inviting me back. Apparently I didn't embarrass myself enough last time, so I need to do it better this time. But let's go ahead and get started with PhoneGap. Enough about me embarrassing. So what is PhoneGap? How many people are familiar with PhoneGap right now, at least in name? How many people have actually used it before? Okay, 2 hands. Awesome. By the end of this, I hope that all of you want to run out and actually go start building your first PhoneGap application. But in a nutshell, and also, how many people are, I can see some of the name tags, but by show of hands, how many people are students? Okay, and how many people are not? You can see the other hand. Okay, so mostly students. PhoneGap is an application container. A lot of words on here, I'll just say it. An application container that allows you to build natively installed mobile apps using web technology. So you build your apps with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The best way to think of it is you have your device. This is my device. The entire user interface on my device is a web view that's 100% width, 100% height, and then everything that's inside of this is the user interface for your application. It's all actually HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So what you're building in that is whatever interactive features there might be, whether it's buttons, whether it's navigational components, whether it's actual content elements, everything in there is just purely web-based technology. Now, the second aspect of PhoneGap is that it gives you a JavaScript-based API to allow you to interact with native operating system functionality from the application that's contained inside of that web view. So, we have our app that's running in the web view on the device. Purely through JavaScript, we'll be able to do things like access the accelerometer, access the compass, access geolocation, search the contacts on a device. So if I want to programmatically from my app search, I want to look for John Doe's phone number, there's an API to do that. You can read and write from the local file system. You can capture multimedia, so that could be using the camera on the device. It could be recording video, it can be recording audio. It can also be used to reliably play back audio across all the different platforms that PhoneGap supports. Has anybody ever tried, I just realized I have a really annoying little iTunes icon happening here. Has anybody ever tried to use HTML5 audio on mobile devices targeting lots of platforms? No. Then a little bit. Then you probably know it's a challenging experience. One of the benefits of PhoneGap is that it does give you an API that's consistent across all the platforms that it supports. So doing things like just playing back media using the PhoneGap Media API, it's going to be consistent across the platforms that you're targeting. Whereas if you're trying to use just pure HTML5 audio tag, if you're trying to hit iOS, well, in a lot of cases you'd be okay. In some cases, if you're trying to do multiple at the same time, you'd have trouble. If you're trying to do Android and you're targeting, let's say, an Android 2 device and an Android 4 device, well, they're going to have vastly different behavior because Android 2 doesn't even support HTML5 audio. But if you were leveraging the PhoneGap Media API, you would be able to do that consistently across both platforms. Now, the third aspect of PhoneGap is that this application experience that you've created using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript can then be packaged into an archive that you would then use to upload to standard mobile ecosystems. So package everything up. If you're targeting iOS, it's an IPA file. If it's Android, it's an APK file. If it's a Windows phone, it's a .zap file. Basically, the same standard archives that if you're developing a native app that the compilation process outputs. You upload that to iTunes, you upload that to Google Play, or you can upload that to the Android market, the Amazon market, and then you get into the standard application ecosystem. So why would you want to use PhoneGap? Before we talk about why you want to use PhoneGap, let's kind of talk about where does PhoneGap fit in the broad spectrum of apps that you can have on a device. Now, on this side over here, we've got really faintly a native app. On this side over here, we've got a web app. In the middle, we have the hybrid app. Now, let's first talk about the native app. A native app is going to be written in the native language for whatever platform you're targeting. If it's iOS, it's Objective-C. If it's Android, it's Java. If you're targeting Windows Phone, it's going to be C#, and so forth. If you're doing native development, you're going to get the absolute best performance. But the thing is, your code base is limited in its portability. You're only going to be able to take that code base to deploy to that one particular platform that you're targeting. Now, and with native, you're going to have immediate access to every API once it's been released by the vendor. So if Google releases a new API for Android, if you're native, you can use it right away. If you're on this side, so we're talking about web, like purely web, HTML running in browser, so mobile Safari on iOS or Chrome or something on Android. When we're talking about mobile web, you have the absolute most pervasive experience. Like you can write your code in HTML, generating HTML and JavaScript. Any device that can consume HTML and JavaScript can then access whatever your app does. Whether it's a phone from 5 years ago, whether it's mom and dad's 386 computer that's still sitting on their desk somewhere collecting dust, or if it's the latest and greatest phone, like tablet or phone that you have, or if it's on the the latest and greatest desktop browser, it'll run basically everywhere. The thing is, when you're running a pure web app, you have limited ties to the operating system layer. Actually, you have no ties to the operating system layer. If it's not exposed in a JavaScript endpoint by the browser, you can't take advantage of it. So I said native, best performance, web app, most pervasive. PhoneGap is a hybrid application, which is kind of dead center. It's going to have the pervasive nature of a web app, meaning you can have that code base that runs in lots of different platforms, lots of different circumstances. But it also gives you the ability to access that underlying operating system functionality that a native app can do, and it also gives you the ability to have distribution through the mobile application ecosystems. Now, if you're targeting a pure web app, you don't worry about like iTunes or the Google Play market. You're just putting it on the web; anybody can consume it. When we're talking about native, it's just the mobile ecosystems. When you're talking about hybrid, it's the mobile ecosystems, but it's that one code base that can be deployed across all the mobile ecosystems instead of an individual app for each ecosystem that you're trying to target. So, has anyone ever tried to build an app that somewhat resembles this as far as the kinds of devices that you're trying to target? Should see like at least 2 hands. So basically, if you're trying to target lots of devices, lots of platforms, whether it's phone, whether it's a tablet, whether you have different tablet form factors, there's a lot of variables involved in this process. It's everything from the actual operating system, the dimensions of the device, the pixel density of the device, what variant of the operating system is there. There can be a lot of challenges, and PhoneGap, the aim of PhoneGap is to make getting onto all these different platforms easier with a little bit less of the variables that you have to worry about. So the first thing I'm going to highlight is with PhoneGap. If you go to PhoneGap.com right now, download it, you get all these platforms from a single code base. So with an HTML-based code base, you can download it, deploy to iOS, Android, Windows Phone, BlackBerry, Samsung Bada, Symbian, HP WebOS, Tizen, and Windows 8. And now PhoneGap actually is an open source project, so a lot of people in the community are extending it very, very often. Like there's unofficial ports of the PhoneGap API to Firefox mobile operating system. I've heard rumor about a port of it to Ubuntu's mobile operating system, which isn't even out of developer preview yet. So the number of platforms that are supported is constantly growing, and it's evolving with the industry as it evolves. Whatever those popular platforms are at the time, these are the ones we can give to you right now today. And as other platforms become more popular, well, the aim is that we'll be able to give you those as well. So why else would you want to use PhoneGap app? Let me refresh this at one time because they're not supposed to show up all at the same time. So the first one is you might want to use it if you want a lower barrier of entry into mobile application development. If you're taking on native development, and let's just take one platform for example. If I want to take on iOS, in order to be really successful with that, you have to know Objective-C. Objective-C in general is a more complicated and less approachable language than pure HTML and JavaScript. Actually, what's interesting with the PhoneGap approach is just with HTML and JavaScript, you can use tools, some WYSIWYG type HTML editor or design tools that designers can use which output HTML. They can be used to generate applications, PhoneGap applications, without having to know really any technical programming ability other than a limited amount of scripting to actually interact with whatever JavaScript APIs you want to interact with. So it makes mobile development more approachable and easier to get into. In addition to making it a little bit easier to get into, it also kind of has a lower degree of technical ability that's required in order to maintain these applications. So I don't have to be an expert in Objective-C. I don't have to be an expert in Java. I don't have to be an expert in C#. And all the languages that are involved with all the platforms that I want to target. All I really need to do is be proficient in creating experience using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I focus on my HTML for the structure. I focus on CSS to determine how that's going to be presented to the user. And I focus on JavaScript to add interactivity and, however you want to make it dynamic. Now, as I mentioned, part of this, since it's less required developer skills that you have to maintain, you really just have to use those core web development skills. You also don't necessarily have to maintain a code base. So if I'm targeting, let's say, two platforms, just to make it simple, I'm targeting iOS and Android. I have to maintain, if I was doing it native, I have to maintain two code bases, the native code base, then Java native code base and Objective-C. With that, I have to have bug tracking for both of those code bases. I have to have, wiki or project management, whatever you're trying to do for each one of those code bases, because they are, for all intents and purposes, two separate projects. With the hybrid mobile solution, the cross-platform mobile solution, which PhoneGap gives you, you really only have to worry about that one code base. And yeah, you might have certain bugs that would happen on iOS versus Android or vice versa, but it's all contained in that one code base, can be in that one single bug tracking system, and it can all be managed through that one set of HTML, JavaScript, CSS developer skills. Now, next bullet point kind of goes hand in hand with this, where I said that there's less actual things that you need to take care of. So there's not as many source code repositories, there's not as many bug tracking systems, there's not as many people required to manage all the different builds, all the different platforms. It's in general a reduced long-term maintenance cost. So there was actually a study done 9 months to a year ago by independent market research firm Forrester. And the findings of that study were that a native mobile solution targeting multiple platforms is between 150 to 210% more expensive than a hybrid mobile solution. So meaning choosing PhoneGap to get one code base on multiple platforms is going to be less expensive than targeting mobile on all those different platforms. In addition to that, the more number of native platforms that you tack on increases the amount of expense that you're going to have. So if you want to target every platform there is, it's definitely going to be more expensive to do that natively. Now, the next bullet point, why you might want to choose a hybrid mobile solution with PhoneGap, is that when you're developing PhoneGap applications, they're in a web view. They play by the same rules as a browser, with the exception of the JavaScript API to access the operating system functionality. So whatever you're developing can access anything that's exposed through standard web protocol. So if you already have images, or you already have web services, or you already have whatever content it's exposed through HTTP, or whatever server you're using, you can actually consume that exact same content within a PhoneGap application. So let's say you have a RESTful service and you're using it to expose data to an app that you already have that runs in the desktop browser. Well, you can use that exact same service inside of a PhoneGap application. You can do what's called whitelisting of domains, and you don't have to worry about cross-domain security access that you would have to if you're targeting the mobile or desktop browser. As long as the domain's whitelisted, you can access anything on there. So you can, I can make a request to any server once it's been whitelisted. I can access any existing content. Now, in addition to accessing anything that's currently HTTP-based that's already out there, you can reuse a lot of your content between different properties, meaning my desktop website, my mobile website, and my PhoneGap application, because they're all built on the same technology. So it's all HTML, it's all CSS, it's all JavaScript. So if I'm already using jQuery to make something dynamic for my desktop-based website, I can still use jQuery inside my PhoneGap app. If I already have CSS styles that manage my brand identity, so everything from the fonts to the colors to whatever other aspects that are involved in my brand identity, I don't have to recreate all the assets from scratch. I can reuse the CSS styles. I can reuse whatever images. Basically, it can even be shared in different configurations, so it's one thing that gets used across all of them. So one question I get very, very often is, what does a PhoneGap app look like? And how many people think that because PhoneGap applications are built with web technology, they're built with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, that they just look like text on a page with some underlined hyperlinks? Really? No hands? Usually there's at least one person. Very educated audience. Towson's doing their job.
Just to help you out.
Yeah. All right, we got one hand. Just to help me out. But really, a PhoneGap application can look like anything. HTML is really easy to customize for the presentation layer. We're really limited more or less by our imaginations. Like, what can we think of? What do we want it to look like? How do we want it to look? How do we want to interact with it? If you want it to look like monsters and zombies on the screen, great. It's really easy. Create some images, put them in there. If you want it to look really just plain and textual, you can do that also. It's very, very easy to customize. And a lot of people actually, because it's built on the web development skills, a lot of people already know how to do that kind of customization. Here's an example, the BBC Olympics app. This app, unfortunately, I can't show it because it was only available in the UK, but the BBC, their official app for Olympics coverage last year was a PhoneGap app. They targeted iOS and Android, and here's some screenshots from it. And this had everything from, live news feeds, video clips for coverage of events, basically what you would expect for news coverage of a live event. Yeah, question.
So in terms of native look and feel, when we design the UI, if you have to Android feel versus Windows versus iOS, does it automatically does that, or you have to account for each one of those for giving the look native feel, like native UI elements?
I'll get to a little bit that more in a little bit, but to answer it partially right now. So the question is, do you have to consider multiple platforms for look and feel, or does PhoneGap do it for you? PhoneGap does not do native look and feel for you, but there are open source frameworks to give you CSS styles that look like native. I have a list of them in here, but I know some of them like IUI, there's tools like MobiScroll, which is touch-based scrolling, that they're optimized to look like different platforms, and you can choose which ones you want to take advantage of. The other strategy, and this is the one that I actually recommend more often than trying to match everything native, is to come up with a brand identity for your application and make that experience consistent across all platforms. There's a term which is kind of referred to as the uncanny valley effect, where something is, and I think that this term actually comes from like the robotics type industry or robotics field, where you get something that's close enough to real life, but it's not quite there, then people recognize it immediately as something is being wrong with it, and that comes from trying to create artificial humans essentially. And with cross-platform applications, it's not necessarily a dissimilar topic, because if you try and mimic everything from the native operating system, but you miss just a little bit, people will notice that right away. And so if you create a unique brand identity that this is what your app looks like, this is how you interact with it, and people become accustomed to, oh, this is just a look and feel of that app, then when they use your app on different platforms, they're like, oh no, this is just my app, or this is XYZ brand's app, as opposed to it's trying to mimic everything from the native operating system. So yeah.
So going back a few, when you had the YS.
Yes.
One of the things that I think JavaScript and HTML development doesn't give us is maintainability that the native Java code or native C# or whatever else would give us. With their mature IDEs, mature ways of putting things where they belong, referencing external libraries, so on and so forth.
So,
yeah, that's it.
Okay. So the question was about maintainability of JavaScript code. JavaScript is a great language for a couple of reasons. One of them being that it's dynamic; you can do anything with it, and it doesn't limit you. You can change the behavior of default objects, native types, whatever you want. You can change it. You can do it. That also makes it really dangerous sometimes. And what you're talking about is maintainability. Is that sometimes if people go around changing a lot of things or create what I'll refer to as spaghetti code, it can be very difficult to maintain. There are frameworks for managing that. So there's tools like Backbone.js, Knockout.js, Angular.js. They're all frameworks that give you MVC development paradigms, so model view controller, where you can have each one of your classes logically organized as far as namespacing and have the logical organization of the code, but also the separation of your presentation code from your business logic code from your data model. And when you structure it in that MVC pattern, it's a lot more maintainable than having one JavaScript file that has 6,000 lines of code that dynamically updates everything. You really have to approach it with that kind of long-term aspect up front, as opposed to, I'm just going to build it and make it crazy, awesome, and do everything I want to do, and then never look at it again. And you come back to look at it again 6 months, a year later, and then you're like, oh my gosh, what did I do? So it is definitely possible. It's definitely achievable. But there's also, as far as getting familiar with that, there is kind of a learning curve, but it also, in order to create those highly structured applications that follow standard computer science principles, there has to be that level of computer science, like programming understanding, object-oriented understanding, in order to correctly take advantage of those practices. Like a designer who's coming in and just wants to create HTML elements, they want to add a little bit of scripting, I wouldn't expect them to come in and take advantage of one of those MVC frameworks. But if someone's coming from the developer's perspective, they would be more likely to do that. So I think I went on a little tangent, but hopefully that kind of answers it for you. So here's another app. It's called Zombie Zombie. This was actually in the card-based game category in iTunes. This was actually, I think, #1 at one point. They have over 2 million active users, and I totally don't understand the game at all. I've tried to play it. I don't understand it. But it's a card-based application, so turn-based, card-based, whatever. You have your characters, you flip some cards, it plays some music, some noises, and apparently it's some sort of battle that happens. I don't think I'm the primary demographic that they're targeting, but I think it looks cool. So Wikipedia. Does anybody have Wikipedia installed on their phones right now?
I used to have it installed.
Okay. Yeah, Wikipedia is a PhoneGap application. So they have the code base that they can deploy to multiple platforms. Everything that you see in here, the headers at the top, the footers at the bottom, all the content, it's all HTML and JavaScript. They're reusing the exact same services that are used by the the desktop and the mobile web versions of Wikipedia. It's exactly what you expect for kind of a cross-platform application. Untapped. This is another really popular PhoneGap app. This is college, so I'm pretty sure no one in here likes beer, right? Only the people that are over 21. But Untapped is a social network that's really revolved around the love of beer. A lot of people get really into, I like certain kinds of beer, I like certain kinds of flavor profile, I like it hoppy, whatever. I want to rate every beer that I drink, and I want to track every beer that I drink. You'd be amazed how many people actually do this. Yes, I have an account. I do this sometimes. But basically, they have a iOS and Android app. This is it here, and it looks like an app. It doesn't look like text on a page. It doesn't look like a web page. And it's all about this social experience of drinking beer and recommending different beers to your friends, and your friends cheersing you when you have a beer that they might like also. Here's another app. This one was actually featured in the iTunes store last week. It's called BitTimer. It's an interval training timer for exercise, for workout. Really great looking app. Really kind of like the futuristic, well, I call it futuristic, but let me say minimalistic UI. Great user experience. Another PhoneGap app. Everything that you see on the interface is all HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Here's one that I'm going to show in a little bit, just some screenshots. This is a sample application that I put together for the U.S. Census Bureau to show them how do you go about creating enterprise data visualization type scenarios in HTML-based applications. And here's another one. This is actually one that was on the team that we built it for use internally within Adobe. And it pulls data from Salesforce.com. It's used to track opportunities and measure cost versus your actual expense for the different opportunities that you might be going after. Again, kind of another, this one's iOS and Android, and it's another enterprise type application. Yeah.
So if I were to have an already existing website,
yes,
would I be able to just copy and paste that code into this PhoneGap application and run it, or is it more complicated?
Yes and no. So if you're doing anything dynamic on the server, it's not going to do the server-side processing for you, but if you're doing like just client-side HTML, the HTML definitely can be used inside of it. Now, theoretically, yes, you can just take it, drop it in, put an app, it's going to work. The catch where it's going to happen there is that Apple is very, very controlling over the user experience of an application. So if it does not handle like an offline situation well, Apple's going to reject it. If it's not a really polished user experience, really polished UI, making sure that everything transitions nicely and follows what their UI guidelines for apps, then they might reject it. So you still have to create a UX that feels like an app in order to get into Apple's ecosystem. But the other ecosystems are not as curated. Like Google Play, you can just do whatever you want, drop it into there. Within a half hour, you can have it in the market. The Android market, or excuse me, not Android, the Amazon market has some curation also. It's not quite as strict as iTunes, but you can definitely get it into there. The BlackBerry market has, BlackBerry App World has some curation, so you just got to make sure it's bug-free. Windows Phone Marketplace has curation also, but the most strict of them all, in my experience, has been with Apple. But to come back full circle to your question, yes, you can do that as long as it's a good UX. So now that we've kind of seen some screenshots, let's look at some actual apps, and then I'll get into how do you actually go about building these different kinds of applications. So first thing I want to do is show a couple apps running on the phone. So the first app I want to show, my device unlocked. Does anybody use Capital One for banking? I'm not going to show you my bank account, so don't worry. Do you use the mobile app?
Yeah, just for credit cards, yeah.
Okay, that actually is a PhoneGap app. So I'm showing it here, which is kind of hard to see. Play with the exposure. No, that didn't help. So the app that we have here, it looks like an app. Again, this one's not scrollable. Let's say if we wanted to look for specific branches, we can do that. I'll go by my current location as long as it can find me. And so, it shows me all the ATMs or branches that are nearby my current location. This is an app that's available for both iOS and Android. That is a PhoneGap application. So the next thing I want to show you, let me go ahead over to the iPad here. So the next thing I want to show is actually something that I like to show this app. It's a children's app. I actually wrote this as just kind of an experiment. I have a 2-year-old daughter. We play with a Magnadoodle all the time. Anybody not know what a Magnadoodle is? Okay. So a Magnadoodle is a children's drawing toy. It's like this big plastic thing. You draw with magnets, and there's like steel filings underneath of it, and you draw shapes, and you can wipe it clean. I created a version of this using PhoneGap, so it's running on the iPad here. And I like to show this app because it is absolutely not the typical user experience that people think or commonly associate with HTML and CSS and JavaScript. So it actually uses HTML5 Canvas. Let me make this a little bit brighter. It uses HTML5 Canvas to do some basic drawing. So I can draw, a smiley face, very beautiful. And I can swipe over and I can erase it. I can do some funny things. But basically, you interact with it the exact same way that you would with a real life magnitude. So I can do it's all leveraging the HTML5 Canvas. But I can do some more interesting things, like I can use images for brush techniques. I can do multi-finger drawing. But you'll notice that when I'm using images, there's actually a little bit more complex UI rendering layer, like the logic that's happening here. There's a lot of depth to it. By using those images and the kind of advanced drawing techniques, you can add a lot of depth to what you're creating. Where I have the different textures that are happening here, which look a lot better on the screen than they do on that, but you can see that there's actually some depth involved there. There's different texture, and it's a very rich kind of drawing experience. You can use different shapes, so you can kind of get the point of the types of things that it can do. Every piece of that is all HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There's nothing native about that application. Now,
And have you put it on Google Play too?
That one is only available on iOS. Because I haven't tried it on newer devices, but I actually released that about a year and a half ago. And at the time, the HTML5 Canvas was not hardware accelerated on Android devices, so the performance wasn't as good. And that kind of gets me into a different topic of when you're building these apps, you're targeting the web view on the different platforms. You're leveraging actually the web view for whatever platform you're supporting. So if you're on Android, you're leveraging the Android web view. If you're on iOS, you're leveraging iOS web view. You're restricted only by what the limitations of that platform are. So, like in this case, where Android web views a year and a half ago when I did that weren't hardware accelerated, the performance wasn't there. So that's not an application that I wanted to put across both of them. But I still was able to leverage HTML and JavaScript to create a great experience for iOS, and it was really easy to do. Like the entire code base for that is maybe 200 lines of code, if that. Another app I want to show, I'll show one more children's app, and then I'll get to some more business type of applications. This is an app called Cookie. And this is actually a children's book. So it's got this really rich environment that you can interact with. So we've got the forest. I can swipe through the forest. Everything that you're seeing here is just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's got a full-length feature film embedded inside the application. So if you wanted to watch the full movie, you can do that. This is just using HTML5 Canvas inside of the device. I could turn up the volume, so if you wanted to listen to it, this is actually a full feature-length film.
Does this use the native player for a particular format, or does it depend on the web view?
In this case, it's HTML5 video, so it's whatever the web view supports.
Okay.
The consistency across platforms is getting better. If you were to look at that a year ago, there was more of an inconsistency across codec support on different platforms, different devices. But yeah, in this case, so this is available on iOS right now. I know that there was talk about bringing this to Android. I don't know if they have yet. I haven't actually looked. Might be out there by now. But yeah, it would just have to be in whatever format that the platform supports. So there's the embedded full feature-length film. There's also a book inside this application, so a complete book. I can swipe through different pages. I can tap on it, go to the contents, bring up the table of contents here, and if I want to go to a particular page, I can do that. One of the reasons I like to show this app also, even though it's not like business-like, is because it's very rich visually, and everything that you see as a part of this is all just pure web standard technology. It's HTML, it's CSS, it's JavaScript. There's nothing native happening in this app. So the next app I want to show is the Census app that I was talking about. Now, I put this together as a sample application for the U.S. Census Bureau because I was doing presentation pretty similar to this, just explaining them how they can use PhoneGap within their applications. And I figured, what better way to have them identify with how they can use this technology than to build an application that actually uses their data. So let me go ahead and select. We have Maryland here. Are we in Baltimore County right now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I can select Baltimore County. I can go ahead and view actual census information that was from the 2010 census. So I can see breakdown of population by age, breakdown of population by age and gender. I can go ahead and see, like an ethnic distribution for Baltimore County. I can go ahead and see, an interactive map. If I want to do that, I can scroll into it. I can pan and zoom. Everything that you would expect from an app-like experience. All of this is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There's nothing native about this. And when I say that when you build apps with PhoneGap, you really want to focus on a good user experience, building something that feels like an app, building something that's cohesive and brings meaning to whatever use case that you have for it, as opposed to just building something that's a web page. Like, you can absolutely build great application experiences with this. The lists, the navigational components, the dialogues, everything in that is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Even to the point that if I change the orientation to portrait, the menu is slid off or to the side, but I can tap that and have it slide back out. Things that you would expect just an app to have, not necessarily like something HTML that can or cannot do that. You can absolutely create these types of experiences. Now, just to show you also, I have that exact same application. This is a Google Nexus 7, so it's an Android tablet. And bring it up here. So we'll select Maryland. Automatically selected Kent County, but you can see the same kind of thing where I have the population distribution. I can do the ethnic distribution. You'll notice in actually this case the chart is slightly different. That's because I'm using a charting library in there that will. This is actually high charts. But high charts will choose SVG when it can, and if it can't do SVG, it falls back to a canvas-based rendering, and so that's what's happening here. It's doing a canvas-based rendering. The canvas rendering is a little bit slower than the SVG rendering, but some Android devices don't have fantastic support of SVG, so it does the fallback for you. But I have the maps. I have all the exact same interactive features, and this is all 100% the exact same code base. Now, while I'm showing this, let me go ahead and show one or two more apps. So I'll do this one. This is actually a tourism site from Turkey that created this application. I like it because it's pretty polished. It looks a good user experience. It's exactly what you would expect of an app. And they actually leveraged some open source code that I wrote in it, so I was really happy to see them taking advantage of it. But I can go through, I can scroll, let's see, we'll select museums. If I select museums here, I can do that. So you can scroll through it. You can see it's a nice polished app experience for whatever tourism information there is. 100% the same code base. This is an Android device. This is an iOS device. Actually, you can't see my finger on that. This is an Android device. This is an iOS device. And this is an iPhone 4. It's not the latest generation devices. You can see it's an app. It responds well. PhoneGap sometimes gets beat up, people saying, oh, it's slow, but it's really not. It's about how you go about creating those different kinds of applications. And I'll get into, in a couple minutes, how you go about creating actual performant applications that feel like really good applications as opposed to just, people trying to beat it up because it's built with HTML. So, with that, let's talk about how do you build these apps. If you want to deploy an app locally from your device, if you want to deploy an app directly onto your device, locally across USB, you have to use one of the standard platform editors. So for iOS, this is going to be Xcode. For Android, it's going to be the Android developer tools. Most people use, a lot of people use these through Eclipse. The Android development tools are a separate download. You can use other editors, but in most cases, a lot of people use Eclipse. If you want to target Windows devices, you're going to do Visual Studio. If you want to do BlackBerry devices, you got to download the BlackBerry tools. Depending on which version of BlackBerry, that might be built on top of Eclipse, or it might be a Windows-only editor. and so forth for every platform that you want to target. Now, I'm going to go through the really simple process of creating a brand new application from scratch. So if you download PhoneGap right now from PhoneGap.com, there is a dependency to have those tools installed, but you don't necessarily have to use them. But in this case, I'm going to create a new iOS application. So the first thing I've done is...
You can install Visual Studio on the Mac as well, right?
Inside a virtual machine, yes.
Okay.
However, you cannot run the emulator inside of a virtual machine on like the Windows Phone emulator inside of a virtual machine on a Mac because the graphics isn't compatible. You would have to do the full boot to the Windows operating system in order to be able to run the emulator and have everything. But you can, if you're using Visual Studio inside of a virtual machine, you can do a deployment to a connected device across USB, and that's what I generally do. I don't have the Windows Phone device with me today, or I'd show that too.
For an iOS application, is there a way that you can talk to that necessary IDE across the network and not locally? Because we have a service from Adobe called PhoneGap Build, which will enable you to do cloud-based compilation. So you can be on like Windows and working on an iOS app. So you can do that. But these tools, I mean, you might be able to script something yourself if you want to do that, across the network. But you can definitely, do everything locally. And as long as there is a machine that has Xcode installed on it, and then PhoneGap can compile on it. But basically, so if I want to create a brand new PhoneGap project, you download the PhoneGap SDK from PhoneGap.com. You'll have to have Xcode installed, and you basically run the create command. And so all it is you navigate to the directory where you have PhoneGap installed. Let me just do this, which on my cases right now, users, Trice and documents, dev, PhoneGap 2.5, etc. Actually, this is the Android one. I'm going to jump to iOS. So I'm on the iOS tab. So I went to the where I've downloaded PhoneGap, and I just need to run the create script, which in this case, you just run create. You tell it where you want to create the new project. You want to give it a unique ID. So it's a unique ID for your app, which is generally reverse URL or reverse domain formatting. So in my case, it's com.tricedesigns, and in this case, I called it Towson Sample. And then you want to give it the name of your app. So in this one, I called it Towson Sample. When I go ahead and run that command, it came back. If I go back to Finder, that just created this folder where I have iOS. Inside that, I have an Xcode project, and inside that Xcode folder, there's a www directory. So if I open up the Xcode project, this is now a PhoneGap app that is ready for editing. So if I expand this, I can go ahead and here's my www folder. If I wanted to go ahead and start changing things, I can say Towson. I'll go ahead and launch that on my iPad. And as soon as it builds, the first time you build it, it takes a second longer. But as soon as that's ready, that will actually install on my iPad. All right, it's launching right now. It'll take 1 second.
So while it's loading, can you do a hybrid in case, for example, can you do some of the native functionality and some of the PhoneGap and kind of combine an app together?
Yes, you can. So I've been talking about PhoneGap in the context. And before I get to that real quick, you can see I just put in the text Towson. It's there. I just compiled that app. That is a PhoneGap app. Everything that's here is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And it was that easy to set up, compile it, get it actually running on a device. But back to your question, can you use PhoneGap as a subcomponent within a native application? The answer is yes. And you use it as what's called Cordova view. And now, in the naming, PhoneGap is an Adobe brand. It's based on the open source Apache Cordova project. And now then that explains the naming of Cordova view. But you can use Cordova view as a subcomponent of a native application. And what it gives you is the web view that you can use to render content and the JavaScript to native bridge, so you can do bidirectional communication between your native code and your JavaScript code. And so one really common thing that people do is, let's say if they don't want to use PhoneGap for the full UI. They just want to use it to render the really complex pieces because it's really easy to render complex data in HTML. Whereas if you're doing a native code and you want to do like a lot of reporting on it, it can be a lot more complex, a lot more time consuming. So what I've seen a lot of people do is use Cordova View to do the heavy lifting, to do, let's say, like generating some HTML that comprises a report. And then you have some buttons in there, you tap on a button, it actually jumps back out to the native view, and having transitions between components be native. And so that gives you kind of a more native type of feel, but you're still leveraging the hybrid development technique where you're using HTML for, what I'll call some of the hard parts, but also it can be the same HTML across the different platforms and just the native navigational components.
Now, did you just render that on the device?
Yes, so that's running on the device. Right there. Whoops, it crashed because I unplugged the developer tools. But if I launch it again, so that is actually running on the device. And that's...
What did it create in terms of for the iOS? You have to... Isn't there a signing step?
So...
Before you deploy the device?
I'm using my developer certificates, which I already have installed on here.
Okay.
If I were to try and get it onto another person's device, you still have to follow the provisioning rules from Apple. So you have to get their device ID. If it's a debug build, you have to get their device ID. And then once you have the device ID, you include that in your provisioning profile. And then when you build it, you sign it, you push it up. You can send it to them, they install their devices as long as they're provisioned. If you can also use the Apple Enterprise Signing Certificate, which removes the dependency of the device ID. However, you can only use that if you're targeting devices that are owned by your organization. But with other platforms, it's getting it onto a device is a little bit easier. Like Android, you can install unsigned APKs without any problem. So that was the creation of a really basic PhoneGap app for iOS. I can show it on Android too. But I want to show actually some of the debugging processes before we run out of time here. Yeah.
What would you recommend to do in the case when there is you have a full web-based app?
So when you start a PhoneGap app, you need to have some of the HTML. You have to have something locally in the app. If you just point to a remote URL, Apple will reject you, hands down. So you need to have something in there that handles that offline scenario, and you can pull data from a server. You can pull HTML, you can pull JavaScript from a server, but if you don't have any failover, then they will reject you.
Okay, but would be like a splash screen saying like, "Hey, internet be sufficient"?
I would say probably a little bit more than a splash. Part of your app experience, so not just necessarily like an app, but just have it so that if it says, "Yeah, it doesn't work unless you're connected to the internet," then that's sufficient. So long as it follows Apple's general rules. And Apple has like I don't remember exactly how long, but a pretty extensive list of UI guidelines. As long as it follows those guidelines, you can definitely do it. So, yeah.
I had a question on what you just said in answer to this question. So are you saying that we knew about native plugins? That's a PhoneGap application that has native hooks.
Okay, so yeah, there are two things. So there's Cordova View, which you can use basically a Cordova web view inside of a native app.
Inside of a native app. So
yeah.
This is the reverse.
And then there's native plugins, which is a site where you can expose custom native code in a JavaScript API. And when you do native plugins, you create your native library and a JavaScript interface, and it leverages PhoneGap's native JavaScript bridge, so that if you want to do more than PhoneGap gets out of the box, you can create native libraries. You can interact with them purely in JavaScript, and you can have that kind of communication.
But the Cordova View is not helping you move to multiple devices. Cordova View is just taking advantage of what PhoneGap brings in to the device that is a native coder.
Yes, so that would be a subcomponent of a native application.
Right. But that will not obviously compile to us.
Yeah, but let's say if you have a PhoneGap app and you just want to communicate with like a barcode scanner or like an NFC communication, or you want to do Bluetooth peer-to-peer connectivity across GameKit, you can definitely do that using a native plugin.
Yeah.
So there was a question earlier about network compilation. Adobe has a service called PhoneGap Build. Just go build.phonegap.com, and PhoneGap Build is essentially a compiler in the cloud. You can either upload your code as a zip archive, or you can tell PhoneGap Build tell it to go to your Git repository and pull your code. It will do the device-specific compilations for you, and then return you a URL or a QR code to actually compile your app. So just to kind of give you a sample of what that can do, there is PhoneGap build support built into Dreamweaver CS6. So right here I have an app. It's in Dreamweaver CS6. I've got code view on the left side. I've actually got the live preview on the right-hand side. And what this is doing is it's pulling data from Rotten Tomatoes, which is a movie review site. And so it pulls that data. You can click on it. You can see the details for whatever movie you selected. I already pushed this up to PhoneGap build right before the presentation today. And so it did the compilation for me. And actually, let me go back to here. You can actually see what the different build status is. So on iOS, I actually have an error. That's because I didn't update my signing certificate. You have to have a valid signing certificate in order to be able to push to iOS devices, and that's a rule from Apple, not from PhoneGap. But you can see I've got Android, I've got BlackBerry, I've got WebOS and Symbian, the platforms that are supported by PhoneGap build. Now let me go ahead and show you. Here's a QR code for my Android build, and now I have, this is a Motorola Atrix. It's a pretty normal Android phone running Android 2.3. I'll go ahead and snap a picture of the QR code at some point here. It doesn't like that one. Let me try this one. So I've got it. It's downloading. It'll take a minute to download. Just download this. In progress.
How does that work from an iOS perspective? Does it mean it went through the market and got approved?
No, you're just downloading it to your device. It uses whatever your certificate is. So for iOS, you have your signing certificate. You upload it to PhoneGap build. It compiles in the cloud, actually on an Apple machine, because it does a compilation on an Apple machine, and then gives you the URL. And as long as your device is actually provisioned in the certificate it was signed with, then you can download it right to your Apple device. It installs right on there just by snapping a QR code like that.
But doesn't have to be built in Dreamweaver?
No, it doesn't have to use Dreamweaver. Excuse me. I'm just showing it in this case because there's PhoneGap built support built into it. So in that case, I just downloaded it. I'm launching it. It'll take a second to start up. And what that's going to do, and I didn't put any splash screens or anything in there, so that's why it's black at this point, but it'll pop up here any second, as long as I didn't introduce a bug when I was using it. Okay, here we go. So here's the app. I just installed it on this device. You can see it's here. I've got my list. I can choose an item, click on it, and see the details about it. Everything about this interface is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and I actually never had to leave Dreamweaver in order to be able to do this. Now, you mentioned being able to do that without going to Dreamweaver. So let me go to PhoneGap build. If you go to build.phonegap.com right now, you can get started. Nobody remembers me. Let's hope that I remember my, oh good. I was going to say, I don't remember my password for that one. But basically, when you create a project, so the Rotten Tomatoes project is actually the one that I just uploaded, and I could snap that QR code and download it on my device directly from here. If I didn't use Dreamweaver, I could use PhoneGap build. And when you create a new project, you can either upload a zip archive that contains all your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It'll do the compilation for you, or you can point it at a Git repository. And it can even be a private Git repository, so long as the build service can still access it. It'll pull your code from Git, and where Git is a version control, like code management system. And it'll pull your code, it'll do the compilation, then it'll give you the QR code or URLs to actually download the binaries and get them on your device.
Does it only do Git, or what about like Subversion?
Let me see what they do now. So right now, it's just Git repositories or a zip archive. I'm not sure what the plan was from the build team. I heard lots of things discussed. I don't know if they're doing that, but I know that today, if you do it, it's either Git or a zip archive. If you're doing something in Subversion, you could always pull it, zip it, upload it, and then download the URL. But you can get started with PhoneGap build for free. So you basically go to build.phonegap.com, click on the Get Started button. Once you sign in, you can do one app for free. If you want to do more than one app, it starts at $10 a month. And once you have the paid account, I think it's up to 25 apps, and then there's enterprise accounts also if you want to do more bigger things with it. So that's PhoneGap build. Now let's talk about how do you go about actually debugging and building these apps. Right here, I'm showing the PhoneGap emulator running inside the Google Chrome browser. So Chrome is actually, I would say, the #1 developer tool when you're building PhoneGap applications to do a really rapid development environment, because you can use whatever editor you want. If you want to use like Xcode or Eclipse, you can do that. If you want to use VI, and I actually know a lot of people that hugely rely on VI for editing code. VI is a really, really minimalistic text editor. But you can use whatever you want, and then because they're all just text files. So you mentioned, is there dependency on Dreamweaver? Absolutely not. You can use anything to edit the files, and then you upload them to build if you want, or you can use the PhoneGap. There's command line tooling where I created the project on command line. You can actually do compilation, and you can do deployment to the emulator or to a device all through command line tooling if you didn't want to use Xcode or whatever. But this is the, let me get back on topic here because I sometimes ramble. But this is the PhoneGap emulator. So it's a Chrome browser. It's built on the Ripple emulation environment, which is an open source project that was actually created by BlackBerry. And what it does is it simulates the environment of a device. So in this case, I have it mimicking the aspect ratio of an iPhone. If you can say, what's the information about that? You can see the platform is Apache Cordova, which I mentioned PhoneGap is Apache Cordova. It says what's the device, what's the screen resolution, what's the pixel density. And then it also gives you to do things like simulate PhoneGap API calls. So whether it's network settings or geolocation, or if you want to mimic the access of things like taking a picture, you can do that all inside the emulation environment. So let me go ahead and close this again. And if I wanted to, let's say, use the PhoneGap media capture API for taking a picture, I can go ahead and do that. I'll hit camera here. It's going to give me, this is part of the simulator here. It just gives me the ability to select an image. So I go to pictures, select that one, use select file, and now it's used inside of my PhoneGap application. So that's mimicking the PhoneGap API to actually pull it into the app experience without having to actually be on a device and take pictures.